In this, the fifth lesson to the course, A Critical History of Economic Theory and Policy, we take a closer look at what political economists in the United States contributed to the discipline. Europeans who arrived in North America during the 19th century found that the new nation retained much of the law and tradition that operated in the Old World. Yet what evolved as the American system incorporated a fundamental devotion to the sanctity of property against overt governmental interference. However, following the end of the Civil War in the United States, the founding principles were being challenged by a rapidly increasing population of diverse origins. A perceptive few recognized the symptoms of decay already deeply entrenched. Horace Greeley, owner of one of the nation's great newspapers, was one of those few. He wrote, "The earth, the air, the waters, the sunshine, with their natural products, were divinely intended for the sustenance and enjoyment of the whole human family. But the present fact is that a very large majority of mankind are landless. Those whom society has divested of their natural right to a share of the soil are entitled to compensation, that is, to continuous opportunity to earn a subsistence by labor. But as society is now organized, this is not and cannot be done." Greeley also called attention to the injustice of absentee land ownership. He wrote, "The right of owning land is one thing. The right to own thousands and even millions of acres of land is another." Henry George supported Greeley's candidacy for the U.S. presidency in 1872, but I have found no evidence that two men ever met or corresponded. Greeley, famous for his advice, "Go west, young man, go west and grow up with the country," died shortly after the election. In 1846, Abraham Lincoln added his voice to those calling for reform. He wrote, "As most good things are produced by labor, it follows that all such things of right belong to those whose labor has produced them. But it has so happened in all ages of the world that some have labored and others have, without labor, enjoyed a large proportion of the fruits." Lincoln thought deeply about this problem and concluded as follows: "This is wrong and should not continue. To secure each laborer the whole product of his labor, or as nearly as possible, is a most worthy object of any good government." The opportunity to rise above one's circumstances of birth remained as a primary attraction for immigrants coming from the Old World. The reality was rather different for most. In his 1976 book, historian Burton Bledstein observed as follows: "Property was increasingly concentrated in enduring fortunes that accumulated rather than diminished over time, and by mid-century, the wealthiest 10% of the families in America owned about 70% of the property." We might legitimately ask what has occurred over the last century and a half. Is it possible that the accelerating concentrations of wealth and income is the result of differences in the potential of individuals to produce and achieve? A reasonable question to ask is where individual responsibility versus societal organization begins and ends. Not unexpectedly, the global picture is even more discouraging for those of us concerned with how others are forced to live. And to refer again to Jackson Turner Main's study, he concluded in 1965, "When the frontier stage had ended and society became stable, the chance to rise diminished. All the land worth owning was now occupied, and land prices rose, so that the sons of pioneers, and the newcomers could not so easily improve their positions. Mobility therefore diminished as the community grew older. After several years of studying the reasons for worsening inequality, as well as the cause of cycles of boom to bust, Henry George's Progress and Poverty was first published in 1879. After studying the book, Karl Marx wrote, "As to the book of Mr. Henry George, I consider it as a last attempt to save the capitalist regime. Of course, this is not the meaning of the author, but the older disciples of Ricardo, the radical ones, fancied already that by the public appropriation of the rent of land, everything would be righted." Henry George was not so naive to believe the societal collection of land rent would solve all social, economic, and political problems. What he did believe is that without doing so, none of the other problems could ever be resolved. Upon reading Progress and Poverty, Emma Lazarus was moved to write to Henry George and later published a sonnet in honor of Progress and Poverty. To George she declared, "Your work is not so much a book as an event. For once prove the indisputable truth of your idea, and no person who prizes justice or common honesty can dine or sleep or read or work in peace until the monstrous wrong in which we are all accomplices be done away with." As agitation in support of Henry George's reform proposals grew in Britain, economists there warned that George was stirring deeply rooted animosities. A political economist named William Smart decided to take George on directly. "I am a little afraid that the land question, in this its most recent form, is likely to be the new battleground of poor against rich, the economists in this case being regarded, thanks to Mr. George, as holding briefs for the oppressors." Henry George's assessment was that political economy as taught had seriously deteriorated in clarity and objectivity from the time of Adam Smith and the French physiocrats. In his final book, The Science of Political Economy, Henry George commented on the state of political economy as it existed in 1897. He wrote, "The professors of political economy preferred to unite their differences by giving up what had before been insisted on as essential, and to teach what was an incomprehensible jargon to the ordinary man, which required a great study of what had been written by numerous learned professors all over the world, and a knowledge of foreign languages." Thus, as a consequence, Henry George concluded political economy as a scientific endeavor was undermined. He added, "So the scholastic political economy utterly broke down and tended to protectionism and the German." Henry George's The Science of Political Economy was almost totally ignored by the European educated economists who returned to the United States and to chairs in political economy at major universities. Moreover, what has been called neoclassical economics, pioneered by British economist Alfred Marshall, had arrived, displacing political economy and many of the older professors as well. We reached the end of Lesson 5.